Was sitting in the family room that evening believing I still belonged there, believing that after all the years of giving and adjusting and forgiving I had at least earned the right to sit quietly in my own home with the television murmuring softly in the background while the smell of coffee and baked fruit drifted through the house, and for a few rare minutes nothing was demanded of me, and no one needed to be fed, guided, corrected, or soothed, and my body finally felt its age in a peaceful way, rather than a punished one. But that illusion shattered the moment the front door slammed open with the force of ownership, and my son-in-law entered without greeting, without pause, without acknowledgement of my presence, walking straight across the room like a man who believed space rearranged itself for him, and before I could even react he lifted the remote control and turned off the television mid-sentence as if my time, my rest, and my existence were nothing more than background noise, and then in a voice loud, sharp, and entitled, he told me to go to my room, calling me old and announcing that the living room was his now because he wanted to watch his game, and the silence that followed was heavier than his words because in that silence I looked toward my daughter standing near the kitchen holding shopping bags with shoulders curved inward and eyes fixed on the floor, and in that moment I waited not for an argument or a defense but for the smallest recognition of my humanity, a single sentence, a single protest, a single reminder that this house was my home, and that I was her mother. But instead she said nothing, and that quiet refusal to stand beside me cut deeper than any insult he could have thrown, and something inside me did not break but hardened, not into anger, not into bitterness, but into clarity, the kind of clarity that comes when illusion finally dies and truth stands naked and undeniable. And I understood then that I had been shrinking myself for years, eating the burnt edges of meals so others could enjoy the best parts, lowering my voice, wearing headphones, apologizing for existing, paying bills, quietly absorbing disrespect, smiling through discomfort, believing sacrifice would eventually be repaid with gratitude and respect. But instead it had taught them that my silence meant permission, and my kindness meant weakness, and my home meant entitlement. And I stood up slowly, feeling the familiar ache in my knees, the sound of movement echoing in the room like a closing door, while he had already claimed my couch, opened a drink, and settled in as if I were invisible, as if I were furniture included with the property. And without saying a single word I walked to my bedroom, not to cry, not to hide, but to remember who I was and what I owned. And from the bottom drawer I took out the folder I had kept untouched for years, holding deeds, titles, documents that never raise their voice yet always speak the loudest truths. Papers that do not bend to arrogance or entitlement, and there in black and white was my name, the sole owner of the house I had paid for, maintained, protected, and endured within. And as I looked at myself in the mirror, gray hair, glasses, soft clothes, the harmless appearance that had allowed them to underestimate me, I realized that the grandmother image had been my camouflage and my greatest mistake, because wolves are never threatened by someone they believe will always feed them. And with steady hands I gathered my keys, placed the folder in my bag, and walked back through the house, past the blaring television, past my daughter's avoidance, past the man who smirked and mocked, asking if I was going to get lost, and I did not respond because explanations are wasted on those who mistake cruelty for power. And I stepped outside, closed the door gently but firmly, like placing a final period at the end of a long sentence, and the night air met me with clarity and calm. And as I locked the gate and hailed a cab, I felt something unfamiliar return to my chest, not fear, not sadness, but authority. And I gave the driver a hotel address because for the first time in years I chose myself over peacekeeping, and that night from a clean, quiet room I made a call to an attorney. I once worked beside someone who understood that respect is enforced through structure, and by morning the law had begun its work. Eviction notices served professionally, without shouting, without insults, without emotion, just facts and deadlines and consequences. And when my phone rang with panic and disbelief, I listened calmly, because calm is terrifying to those who rely on intimidation, and I told my daughter to read the papers and follow them because I was no longer available for screaming, manipulation, or guilt. And by midday the utilities were suspended, the internet, the cable, the extra credit card, not as revenge but as correction, because privileges are not rights and support is not ownership. And later I dressed differently, not to impress but to align my exterior with my restored spine, buying clothes that fit a woman who no longer apologizes for taking space. And when my daughter finally stood in front of me again, asking for peace and normalcy and a return to how things were, I told her gently that I was not angry, I was finished shrinking, and that order had replaced chaos and boundaries had replaced fear. And that night I slept deeply, not like someone escaping, but like someone who had finally returned to herself, knowing the next days would bring consequences, truths, and discomfort, but also knowing with absolute certainty that the living room had never been his kingdom, the house had always been mine, and so had my life.